Good morning, everyone. So, my name is Ahmed Samir, and I work for the Charging Interface Initiative, which is the world's leading association for e-mobility and EV charging. And now we are present in the Middle East, and I have the pleasure to be in Doha for the first time ever. So what I'm going to do for the next 15, 20 minutes, I'm going to give a global overview of what's happening in the e-mobility sector globally. So first to start with, I think we are all aware of what's happening when it comes to climate change and the urgency that we have now to take an action to reduce the impact of climate change and mitigate it. What this graph shows is how much emissions we actually need to reduce within the transport sector to be aligned with what we call the 2 degrees Celsius for the Paris Agreement. And what you can see here is, so with the current adopted policies, governments across the globe have announced different policies and regulations to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. But what has been announced so far is really not enough to even tackle a very small margin of what's being emitted from the transport sector. So all of the policies and regulations that have been announced up till today have only reduced close to 17 gigaton of CO2 emissions. And the policies that have been announced but have not been implemented yet will result into another 25 gigaton of CO2 emissions. So that's combined is less than 50 gigaton of CO2 emissions. The budget that transport sector overall has to be aligned with the 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, specifically 2, from now till 2050, will actually be fully consumed if we continue with the same trajectory that we have today by 2035. So again, all of the budget of the CO2 emissions that we have to be aligned with the 2 degrees Celsius will be fully consumed if we continue in the same trajectory by 2035, not 2050, which shows the urgency that the transport sector has to take an action. What this shows you here is the global alignment. So this is around 50 gigatons of CO2, which can be mitigated today if governments across the globe have not taken an action or put policies in place, took the actions that they need to take. So there's another 50 gigatons of CO2 that could be mitigated if governments can take an action. All of this would only allow us to reach 2 degrees Celsius pathway, which again is not enough to be aligned with the Paris Agreement and keep the temperature the rising temperature as we need it to be. So that shows you that if we electrify today every single car on the road, that's actually not enough, which means we have to look at other measures, which we call it avoid and shift. We need to avoid transportation when we can and where we can, and we need to shift to more sustainable modes of transportation like public transport and shared mobility. So all of this has to go hand in hand. So what governments across the globe have started to do is mainly 5 key measures that we are seeing across the globe now. The first one is we're starting to see governments phasing out internal combustion engine vehicles. And this is by setting a very clear vision on when the phase out will happen, how it will happen, and what is the role of the private sector versus the government in that transition. And what that does is it gives a very strong signal to the market, whether it's investors to start investing in the market, or to the OEMs to start producing different models that would be available to the end user. The second measure that we started to see is binding regulations. So you need to phase out ICE, but then you start to put binding regulations for introducing new models of electric vehicles. And what that does, it ensures or makes the OEMs start to producing different affordable models for the end user, and that by default will increase the uptake of EVs. The third one, which is also very important, is the financial incentives. And we have seen in different markets, especially in Europe and the US, financial incentives have a very clear and direct target on the uptake of EVs, whether it's a fleet or private vehicles. And this sometimes happen in tax returns and for other fiscal incentives that have directly contributed to the uptake of EVs. The fourth one is the deployment of the charging infrastructure. And we have seen Qatar as a leader in this, other countries in the region as well. Governments have a role to initiate the deployment of infrastructure. Setting the infrastructure, you always have the chicken and egg problem, and that's where the governments have a very clear role to play to deploy the first version of the charging infrastructure that the private sector can then build on. The fifth one, which is also very important, is the consumer awareness, whether this consumer is a fleet or an end user, private user. And that creates the demand that the OEMs and the investors need to see to be able to invest sustainably and deploy more infrastructure, introduce more EVs, etc. What we have seen already that many governments across the globe have already announced mandatory or legally binding ICE phase-out dates. We have seen this map shows you the different countries that have already announced these dates, starting from 2030 up to 2050. And what you will see in those markets, based on this announced targets, companies and OEMs and dealers are starting to produce and introduce different models that are affordable for the end user, and that will create the ambition loop that continues to increase the uptake of EVs. So this map shows for cars, vans, and light-duty trucks, but it's not only happening across those modes. What we see as well is even internal combustion engine trucks. The different countries have already announced phase-out dates. And again, we are seeing in these markets that models are being more affordable. Companies are competing to provide affordable models that would be suitable for the end user. And not only trucks, but also we are seeing this with buses. So this map shows the different countries that have already announced and phase-out dates for internal combustion engine buses, which means even if people are not willing to buy those EVs in those markets, they will have to because they will have no other option. And that what all of this did is companies and OEMs have also started to commit to only fully introduce and produce electric vehicles. And this map shows you the different companies that have announced already that they will only produce battery electric vehicles by specific dates. Some of them started from even 2025, like Volvo. We are seeing other companies that are announcing these targets only for specific regions, based on the regulations and the market demand. But the trend that we are seeing that more companies are starting to expand that scope to go global for only introducing and producing battery electric vehicles. So there are two things that governments are actually doing to make sure that this is happening sustainably as well. So the first measure or policy pathway that governments are actually looking at is what we call the ZEV regulations. And the second one is the CO2 standards. And both of them are going hand in hand. As we mentioned earlier, you cannot electrify every single vehicle today. You have, even if you do, you still have the ICE vehicles, the ICE fleet that's already on the road. And for that, you have to introduce more stringent CO2 standards to make sure that you are increasing the fuel efficiency, which in hand will reduce the emissions coming from those vehicles. And what these two do, they provide long-term market assurance for investors to invest at scale, and they also boost supply and the market availability for the different competitive models that will be available for the end user. Just looking at the ZEV regulations, one of the very successful examples happened actually in California. California was the very early adopters of the ZEV regulations back in the 1990s with what they called Advanced Clean Cars regulations. Now they're in phase 3. You have Advanced Clean Cars 1, 2, and 3. And what those regulations do, they allow or they force companies to sell a specific volume of electric vehicles within the state of California by specific dates. And what that does is, because companies have to sell those vehicles, they have to provide them at competitive prices for people to buy them. And that would, in hand, force other companies to start providing other models, and that's what creates the market and creates the demand as well. What we have seen after California, you have China, South Korea, and some states in Canada and the US have also adopted different versions of Advanced Clean Cars regulations, which had in turn increased the EV sales in those specific markets. And what you see today as a result of these regulations is California, compared with the other states in the US, has EV adoption rates, which is almost 6 times the other states. That shows what those regulations have as an impact on the market. The second, which I mentioned, is the CO2 standards. We need to make sure that as we continue transitioning to zero-emission vehicles, we are also reducing or increasing the efficiency of the internal combustion engine vehicles that we sell and use today. And maybe this is something that has been already adopted with the different regulations. I think even in the different GCC countries, including Qatar, actually globally, 80% of the global market has already enforced CO2 standards regulations, which have increased the fuel efficiency as well. So this is something that the OEMs are able to produce today, and people can use today. Just governments need to put this in place, so OEMs will start introducing these vehicles into their markets. And what we project will happen, and this is based on the announced regulations already, Europe as a region will be the first region to reach zero CO2 per kilometer, and we are speaking about the zero tailpipe emissions, not the emissions for producing the vehicle or the electricity generated, just the tailpipe emissions from the vehicle. So Europe will be the first region to reach the 0 gram of CO2 per kilometer by 2035, 2040. And this again, like today you have, which is the lowest globally, 25 gram of CO2 per kilometer. And you can see here the slope actually from 2000 to 2020 based on the different regulations that have been introduced. And this slope will continue to go down as we reach zero emissions. What we see as well, as we mentioned earlier, infrastructure is very instrumental to make sure that that whole ecosystem is built in a sustainable way. And we have seen these different governments that have announced different targets investing heavily in the infrastructure. And one of the very successful examples with the US, with what they call the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which includes a very major investment in the infrastructure of $7.5 billion in installing over 50,000 charging points across the US. Different countries and different regions have also invested in infrastructure. Qatar has massively invested in infrastructure, and you can see here actually the maquette of that project. And I think you have a tour at the third day to actually explore it in person. But all of this is very important to make sure that the range anxiety is not there. People feel comfortable buying EVs, whether it's individual or fleets. And what we see here is a piece of information that I actually was not aware of is fleet actually contribute to 2/3 to the global emissions coming from the transport sector. Although the size of the fleet versus all cars on the roads is actually only a quarter of all of these vehicles. So that shows the contribution from the fleet on the transport emissions and the urgency to electrify the fleet. And the good news is fleets actually can electrify today because there's a financial sense for it. So what used to be not financially feasible is now financially feasible. So you have fleets are able to run an electric fleet and be more financially profitable than an internal combustion engine fleet. So some fleets in the different regions have reached what we call the cost parity, where an EV would be cheaper overall. We call it the total cost of ownership than an internal combustion engine vehicle. I'll mention this in the next slide. The other benefit of this is the benefit on the health. So electrifying the fleet, only the fleet, has a potential impact of avoiding over 120,000 premature deaths every year, just from emissions that we would avoid if we electrify the fleet. The other point is, as I mentioned, technology is now making it more feasible for the fleet, not just passenger fleets, but also commercial fleets and 2- and 3-wheelers. Across the board, vehicles are available, financially feasible, and in some markets, competitive more than internal combustion engine vehicles. And what this slide shows you is what we call the total cost of ownership across the different markets. So in some cases, like if you look here at light-duty commercial vehicles in the US, last year they have already reached the cost parity, which means if you run an electric fleet in the US with vans, it's actually more financially profitable than an internal combustion engine fleet. In some markets, we are expecting to see this cost parity in the next 5 or 10 years. But we are seeing companies are starting to invest already in the fleet, and it takes time to really operationalize an electric fleet, especially if you transition. So if you have a fleet, it's best that you start now so you understand the process, the infrastructure, pains and gains, etc. And what we see as another trend for fleets as well is the emerging of what we call as a service model. So now fleets don't really have to pay for the capex to electrify their fleet. We're seeing different companies, financial institutions, providing battery as a service the car as a service, and sometimes even the charging as a service. So all of this is making it much more financially feasible and easier for fleets to do the transition. So this is already available in the region, in some countries in the region, and we expect this to be more available as we go in time. So this is from the International Energy Agency report, the EV Outlook that was published last week. And what we can see here, that the EV uptake is actually growing almost on an exponential scale. So now we are almost at 16.5 million EVs on the roads, and we speak about plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and battery electric vehicles, which again, if you look back 7 years, no one was buying EV. The same is happening with the availability of the different models. So now we are seeing more and more models being available in the market, especially with the Chinese OEMs going very fast with the development of different models, which are being very affordable. And just one point which was asked earlier about the battery. One of the key actually drivers of that slope is the decline in the price of the batteries. Over the last 10 years, the cost of the battery actually declined by 80%. Again, I'll mention the number again. Over the last 10 years, the cost of the lithium-ion batteries declined by 80%. Last year, China produced more batteries than the whole world needs actually to produce EVs. So there's no shortage of minerals as we speak today. Maybe there will be an issue as we go further and the uptake will be much faster and higher. But today, we don't have a shortage of the minerals. We don't have shortage of the batteries. Companies have actually collectively announced over 7.9 terawatt-hour of capacity of batteries by end of 2025. That's almost 4 times the expected demand that we would expect by that year. We are expecting around 1.6 terawatt-hour by end of 2025. So we have enough batteries, even if we electrify every single car, that's actually would need less than half of that expected, projected, announced capacity by end of 2025. So that decline in the battery prices, and which is also joined by an increase in the efficiency of the batteries, and also increasing the reliability of the batteries. People don't have to think about the range and how far an EV would take me. And that's also, and the cost of the battery is usually around 40% of the cost of an EV. So that directly has an influence on the cost of EVs. And we see this going down and down as we speak. The same trend is happening with the charging infrastructure, whether it's the DC or AC, fast and the slow chargers. We're seeing almost an exponential slope on the uptake of chargers. And this is driven mainly by governments started to deploy the first numbers of chargers across the countries, followed by the investors that are investing heavily in this as well. And I want to close with this slide, which basically says, to build an EV ecosystem, you have to have different pillars. What we used to have in the past is you have a car, which you only need to go to the gas station once a week, or it depends on how much you drive, and that's it. But now what we're saying is that's a whole new ecosystem that's being built. So an EV is directly connected to the electricity and how much you would need. And as we go, you will need to continue producing electricity to meet that demand. And as the climate discussions go, you need to make sure that electricity is also produced in a sustainable way as well. And that links to the grid, that links to the capacity, that links when you charge, et cetera, et cetera. That makes a complicated ecosystem that has to be well regulated and well planned in advance. So there are 4 pillars that we believe are the key pillars for building a sustainable ecosystem for e-mobility. The first one is the infrastructure and funding. You need to deploy the infrastructure at scale, and you need to project the uptake and build the infrastructure that would meet that demand that you expect. The second, which is also very important, is you need regulations and policies. And regulations and policies have to be across the board, not just regulating the price of electricity and who can sell electricity, but regulating the incentives for people to install infrastructure and make it available for the public, for the OEMs to introduce the EVs, for the fleets to go electric, for the end users to go electric, et cetera, et cetera. It has to be across the board and across the different stakeholders. Another one, which is very important, is the human resources and the skills. Today, as we go to a new different industry, that creates a very big opportunity. As we speak, there's no one single country that's dominant for the EV production. Maybe China is. But that creates a lot of opportunities for local manufacturing or local industry. So countries now, and we have seen this in Saudi, taking the advantage of this, it's an opportunity to every single country to localize that industry. Not just the vehicle, the supporting industry and the infrastructure as well. And also, as we move to that new industry, you need to train the people in the existing traditional ICE industry and make sure that as we transition, those people don't lose their jobs. And last one, which for me is the most important one, is the sustainable energy mix. As we move at scale, we need to make sure that we are producing electricity in a sustainable way. We need to make sure that we are actually enabling this environment to be investing ready, interesting for investors to come in and invest, because governments alone cannot actually deploy the infrastructure at a scale that would be enough for the end users. So you need to create an ecosystem for that to happen and also to produce electricity in a sustainable way. So that's, in my view, is how you build an ecosystem, and that was my last slide. And I don't know if you have any questions, but that's all from my side. Thank you very much for listening.